Okay, you can hear me? Great. So, I'm Julian, and I'd like to thank the FSOSS organizers for inviting me back to talk to you guys this year about a more meditative kind of topic. This is not technical. I don't have lots of graphs like Meki had. I don't have lots of data. I don't have lots of sort of tried and true processes to go through like Josh did to tell us about how to get our communities to run better. But I've spent a lot of time, about 15 years, working with open source software. And I founded a nonprofit organization that uses open source software to help other nonprofit organizations. So I literally have made my living off open source for a long time. And we've seen a lot of things happen over the years with, is Linux ready for the desktop? Is open source, where's it going? Is it taking over the world? Are we beating Microsoft, et cetera? And lately there's a lot of talk about the sharing economy. I think open source is often thought of as part of that. I have some ideas that I've tried to put together here that I'll share with you. So that's sharing. And hopefully it's thought-provoking, and maybe we'll discuss definitions and other arbitrary things like that, which always come into play in these discussions, but I hope you find it interesting. So, in 2011, Time magazine did an article that said 10 ideas that will change the world, and sharing was number 8. And the same year, opensource.com, there was an article, The New Sharing Economy. A quote from that is, sharing is changing the way we work and live together as a society. If you were working with technology and open source in the last few years, hopefully this sort of zeitgeist sounds familiar. It's certainly something that I picked up on and felt like, oh, open source is, are we having an influence, or what's going on here? There's this vague idea, a bandwagon, or I think maybe a retcon story if you're into science fiction, fantasy stuff, and role-playing and fan fiction. We might look back at what's happened and we do a retcon story to say, well, what really happened now that we know from our future perspective? We know that open source is linked to all this somehow. And I think that story goes something like this. Open source led the way, came first, and then there was sharing music on Napster, and now we're couch surfing, and there's Airbnb, and there's you can pick and choose different things to put into this story. But who has had a conversation like this with somebody at some point about open source and technology and where it's all going, where it came from?
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Martin. I'm a faculty here.
Someone's sharing with us right now.
Oh, he's in the BSD program, but not midterms at the moment.
This is fascinating.
And doing most of those things. Born and raised in Toronto, Ontario.
They're fixing it now. Okay, that's good.
The environment so please welcome Justin Bob.
Hey. All right. Is that it? Are we back to our regularly scheduled presentation? All right. So we'll see if anybody else interrupts. The common thread between all that stuff is sharing, right? Like in open source, we share a lot of stuff. And all these models that people talk about, there's sharing going on of some kind. Sharing, and I think the idea of there's an aspect of all these models which is not based on selling you something or paying a price for something. There's somehow a different cost model is worked in. So the common thread among these things in all these versions of the story is sharing. But I don't think sharing is what defines open source. And I don't think it's actually what defines a lot of what we call the sharing economy either. I think if we think of what today are, I believe, the widely regarded exemplars of the sharing economy, something like Airbnb, you're sharing your space, but you're not giving it away. You're not co-creating a space with people. You're offering something that you have, but the interactions between the participants are not the same as they are in open source. Uber, you can share your passenger seat in your car with somebody else for a fee. You can use this sort of surplus resources and share them perhaps. But the economics of these systems aren't driven by sharing. They're driven by deriving value from the surplus, whether it's the spare room or the spare seat in your car. And I think truly open systems like open source, the driving factor is abundance instead of scarcity. It's the infinity of sharing as many copies of the source code with as many people as you want that drives open source. Now that abundance leads to a whole lot of sharing, but the sharing is the side effect. It's not the fundamental thing that defines the system. The value in an open system, like open source software, is created from that abundance by a community that engages in the sharing. And what Josh was talking about 2 presentations ago, I think, is essentially the recipe for community. If you've got this abundant resource, what does the community need to do to create value around that resource? It's not as simple as release early and often and everything else is going to work. There's a lot more you have to do, but the fundamental enabler of that is the abundance of the resource that you're sharing. So here's a bunch of examples. I'll look through a few things here, some of which are familiar, and some of which I think will be very out of left field. We'll see what you think. So open source. Well, the resource we're talking about is source code, the expertise to develop source code. And when the resource is scarce, that's a little small there, but when the resource is scarce, then you derive value by hoarding source code and by selling the software from the source code that people don't have access to. This is what Microsoft does. This should be very familiar to everyone in the room. It's the commercial software model. When the resource is abundant, then many eyes make all bugs shallow. We know about analyses that say open source software is better privacy and security than closed source software because of the number of people involved and because it's open. And ultimately, you have this ecosystem of people. You have a community that creates services around the software, supports the software, and that maximizes the benefits of everyone who's participating so that you have this abundant source code and everyone benefits. Wikipedia. Mark at the keynote right here earlier today was talking about Wikipedia as encyclopedias as an accessible example of open systems, and obviously he's talking about Wikipedia. It's very similar to open source. You're not talking about source code, you're talking about knowledge and the ability to research information and a whole lot of ability dealing with writing and communicating and editing and so on. If you've ever dug into behind the scenes in Wikipedia and looked at change requests back and forth on pages and if you ever read the talk page for active Wikipedia pages, that's a very interesting sausage factory. And it's a lot like what you might see in bug requests or bug reports in open source, where things are marked as won't fix. And you get a lot of discussion like that in Wikipedia. Now, in the old model, like Microsoft Encarta or Britannica, you hoard all that expertise to deal with all of that stuff and you sell encyclopedias. In the abundant model, like Wikipedia, supposedly, studies tell us there's actually better accuracy in Wikipedia. It's much broader than any other encyclopedia. It covers so much more stuff. Just look at the Star Wars page of Wikipedia versus certain pages about actual astronomical phenomenon. The breadth is impressive. It's very timely. Have you ever gone to Wikipedia to look at things that are happening right now? News events, it's pretty impressive. So you got a whole community of people, again, working around that body of knowledge. It's shared and abundant and open, but it's that community that then harnesses that, works together, and makes it useful for everyone. Interestingly enough, I think there's similar reticence on the part of many more conservative or traditional elements of society to using Wikipedia, because we've probably all heard academics or others say they distrust Wikipedia because of, anybody can contribute things. There's no, and there was the spin-off, I'm forgetting the name of it, but there was a prominent spin-off where they were going to place prominence for expert edits over, edits by just lay people. Yeah, so I think there's some people have a distrust of it, and just the fact that anybody can edit it. School teachers, well, anybody, you've got it on Wikipedia, well, that doesn't mean anything, because anybody could edit it. But, studies have shown that it is generally pretty accurate. And with open source software, of course, we've all heard people criticize open source software because, well, it's free, so it can't be good, or, it's anybody has access to the source code, so you can figure out all the security holes, so therefore it's not secure. There's all these sort of non sequitur arguments for these things that try to turn where their strengths into perceived weaknesses. Now, renewable energy is maybe not something you're used to thinking about as a potential open system, but I think renewable energy is very interesting. I have solar power array on the roof of my house, so I've been thinking about this a lot for a few years. And with renewable energy sources, the electricity comes for free, basically. You don't have to buy natural gas and burn it to make electricity. You just have the solar panels on your roof and you get electricity just because the sun's shining. So in a natural gas electrical system or fossil fuel-based electrical system, the price of energy comes from the cost to produce, which is highly affected by the fuel. Not so much in nuclear reactors, because you can get so much energy from splitting a uranium atom that the fuel ratio is a bit different. But there is still fuel there. And of course, your access to the fuel and control of the markets and fluctuations in that price are very significant. Whereas if you imagine a whole electricity system based around totally renewable sources, then the only real cost is the infrastructure. The energy itself comes for free. How would that make things different? Well, the problem is, it's fun to think about, but the problem is energy storage is not a solved problem. Like imagine if with open source, we had all this distribution of source code, but rather than it just sort of being there on the website to download at any point in time, you could only download, there was a limited number of copies to download only certain times a day. Well, that wouldn't work so well. And that's essentially the problem with our electricity system. We need to constantly produce electricity into the power grid because we can't really store it. There's no effective ways of storing it on a large scale. And there's also, of course, no community of people, it doesn't match the other models. There's no community of people engaged in enabling the sharing or use of that resource. But I think it's very interesting to think about there's a potential abundance there. If in renewable energy, the principal difference between that and traditional forms is the abundance of the resource itself. And so what are what are the barriers to that becoming open in the way that open source is? And I think it's the storage and the community. Airbnb, exemplar of the sharing economy, so-called. Well, the resource in that case is accommodations. Ooh, dark. Oh, light. Let there be light. Accommodations, that's the resource we're talking about. And in the traditional model, you go to a hotel or wherever and you charge for rooms based on what what price the market will bear. Airbnb is not much different. Who's rented a place on Airbnb? Yeah, and you shop around based on price, don't you? I think, yeah, there's sharing. It's maybe related to these ideas in a very nebulous way, but I don't think it bears much resemblance to open source at all. And if we try to think of what an abundance-based view of the accommodations resource would be, I don't know. What does an infinite supply of accommodations look like, really? Maybe couch surfing. Does anybody use couchsurfing.org? So maybe that's more in that line, but I don't know. I think really the fundamental difference there is the price is zero or very low. And there's certainly, again, not a community that exists to support people's access and use of abundant accommodations. There's a lot of social interaction on Airbnb, rating people back and forth, and people sort of know each other a bit. They try to build a bit of a social network aspect in there, but it's the engagement of those people in a variety of activities to support the use of the accommodation, to sort of enable the use of the accommodation. It's not really the same as some of the other examples. Napster, who remembers Napster? Yes, ooh, lots of hands. If we look at the resource being music, I think Napster is a really interesting example because for a little while there, music was, which is normally, of course, sold by big corporations on various media. Music is a very limited resource in that traditional model, and we all know that that model has changed and the price of music has now bottomed out completely. And with Napster, for a brief time, there was a community of users that freely and voluntarily contributed into that system. I'll put all my music in, and you put all your music in, and everyone was benefiting from the contributions of others in what was essentially an infinite resource. I know lots of people who have extremely large music collections because they got it all at that point in time.
But it wasn't the creators that put it in.
No, it wasn't the creators that put it in. And the problem was it was illegal due to IP issues. Like, there was an abundance, but it was an illegal abundance. Like with open source and with Wikipedia, everything's sort of given freely. Whereas Napster, there was an abundant resource that was essentially illegally co-opted into this kind of ecosystem. So I think it does actually, in a way, fit the model of an open system, but not totally. Like, there was a significant barrier there. Creative Commons is an interesting view. If you think about layering Creative Commons over this, if all of the music in Napster was licensed under Creative Commons at the time, no problem. But of course it wasn't. And the barrier to making that happen is that the creators of all the music that was there aren't going to relicense their stuff, right? Because it defeats the whole business model. And unlike Wikipedia, where to some extent there's a commoditization of knowledge that happens because you just bring all these people to bear and then everything is knowable and everything can be written about. When it comes to a more personally creative activity like music, you and I can't just go and recreate the, all the songs of the Rolling Stones. It's just not going to happen. So, yeah, it's sort of close, but not quite. Now, last one that I put up there, open relationships. Love is the resource. I love this example because I think it's so out of left field that those of us who work with open source are used to thinking about open source, and we think it's all natural, normal, and perfectly fine. And a lot of the rest of the world looks at it and goes, you give away your source code? Like, you give away the software, so how do you make money? And a lot of the rest of the world thinks we're crazy. And we don't really get why they think we're crazy. But if we walk through this example, maybe you'll understand how the rest of the world views us as open source, because unless you're involved in open relationships, this is kind of weird. So normally we think about love in terms of, well, I'm going to find the one, I'm going to be their one person, they're going to be my one person, we're going to be monogamous, we're going to love each other forever. And if either of us loves anybody else, then it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket, because love is a scarce resource and it's precious, and if I love anybody else, then there's less love for the person that I pledged myself to. People who have open relationships view it the other way around. You're open to loving more than one person, they're open to loving more than one person besides you, and that doesn't reduce the love, it adds love to their lives. And so there's this community of people who all care for and support each other in a network, depending on how your relationships are organized. And it's all just based on how people are connected to each other. And they don't consider that to diminish their connections to anyone in particular. Now, maybe that sounds weird. It is weird to a lot of people, but so is open source. And I think it's an interesting view of a resource that is often thought of as scarce, but many people treat as abundant. So is it open based on my discussion? And you may differ on one or more of these points. I think open source clearly is an open system. And Wikipedia. Renewable energy, not so much, as discussed. Airbnb, definitely not. Napster, yeah, almost, except for the legal aspect. There's something preventing the necessary factors from all coalescing there. And in open relationships, yes. So what do these things have in common, the things that are successful open systems versus not? Well, open source, the resource, what I think a lot of this hinges around is the nature of the resource. It's abstract. It's not it's almost like a metaphysical entity. Like the source code exists as ones and zeros somewhere. There's sort of a physical representation of it in the memory of the computer, but fundamentally it's an abstract, almost like a mental resource. Same thing with the knowledge and the expertise that allows Wikipedia to happen. Whereas renewable energy, it's a physical resource. It's limited in supply and storage, and the distribution method is under strict control as well. There's no commoditized distribution. Accommodations, obviously physical. You can only build so many hotels, houses, and so on. Music, well, the music recordings aren't much different than source code, at least in the way the Napster system worked. So I declare that as an abstract resource as well. And love is certainly not a physical thing. So what can we take from that? So I think the hallmark of a truly open system is there's a community arising around this abstract, abundant resource that promotes and supports the use of that resource. And that's what I think makes open source, and why things that people lump into the sharing economy aren't really the same thing. In fact, I think when you think about those examples I went through and that definition, I think far from being mainstream like the sharing economy that gets all this attention in news media, the communities that drive open source systems are outliers. We're the oddballs. We are really, really unusual. And I think one of the best examples of this that I'll just go through very briefly is from a sort of long essay called "In the Beginning Was the Command Line" by Neil Stephenson, which some of you I'm sure have read, and some of you I'm sure have not. And one of my favorite things about this is near the beginning, he compares operating systems to car dealerships clustered around an intersection. And Microsoft is the dealership on one corner selling these colossal station wagons that spew exhaust and clunk along and have no style whatsoever. Apple is on another corner selling sleek Euro-styled sedans that are hermetically sealed, so you can't fiddle with the insides, but they're beautiful. And then FSOSS is on the third corner selling fully operational Batmobiles. That shows the time frame when he wrote this, that he was writing about BIOS, so it's kind of old. And then on the fourth corner is Linux. Right next door, it's not a business at all. It's a bunch of RVs, yurts, teepees, and geodesic domes set up in a field and organized by consensus. And the people who live there are making tanks, not cars. And these are not old-fashioned cast-iron Soviet tanks. They're more like M1 tanks of the US Army, made of space-age materials, jammed with sophisticated technology from one end to the other. But they're better than Army tanks because they've been modified in such a way that they never ever break down, they're light and maneuverable enough to use on ordinary streets, and they use no more fuel than a subcompact car. And these tanks are being cranked out on the spot at a terrific pace, and a vast number of them are lined up along the edge of the road with the keys in the ignition. And anyone who wants can simply climb into one and drive it away for free. Abundant tanks. It's an abundant resource. Now, the group giving away the free tanks only stays alive because it is staffed by volunteers, a community, who are lined up at the edge of the street with bullhorns trying to draw customers' attention to this incredible situation. And a typical conversation goes something like this. Save your money, accept one of our free tanks. It is invulnerable, can drive across rocks and swamps at 90 miles an hour while getting 100 miles to the gallon. And the prospective station wagon buyer says, I know what you say is true, but I don't know how to maintain a tank. Well, you don't know how to maintain a station wagon either. But this dealership over here has mechanics on staff, and if something goes wrong with my station wagon, I can take a day off work, bring it here, and pay them to work on it while I sit in the waiting room for hours listening to elevator music. But if you accept one of our free tanks, we will send volunteers to your house to fix it for free while you sleep. Who's ever gone to fix people's computers? Their relatives, probably. Stay away from my house, you freak. But can't you see that everyone is buying station wagons? This is, I think, how people look at open source. Really. Like, have you ever tried to explain open source to your grandmother or, whomever? Grandmother's the proverbial people to pick on, aren't they? It's terrible. But it's true. I think, and the bizarreness of open source as a system and as an example comes from the abundance of it, the infinity of the resource and the giving of it away, and the community that will come to your house and fix it. Like, what do you mean? I don't pay you money in a normal transaction that I'm used to in every other aspect of my society? Can't you see everyone is buying station wagons or buying encyclopedias? Like I said before, there's like the distrust around Wikipedia stems from the things that make it open, the same things that make people think that the open source folks are freaks, or everyone being monogamous, because that's what everybody does. You can't think of love any other way. So bottom line, I think, is participating in open systems and open thinking is a radical act. It breaks all the rules. Open systems are not part of the sharing economy. We haven't won, and we haven't coalesced into some future that's going to last for 350 years, like Mark was saying. There's a lot of work to do to make that future possible. Truly, open systems are rare and strange, because true abundance is a rare thing. But technology and other enabling factors can make open systems possible, and when that happens, they offer benefits that you can't get any other way. Open source, is only possible, obviously, with computer technology, but it's also only possible with the internet, I think, at least on the scale that it happens at now, at the scale necessary to meet Mark's vision of 350 years of freedom. You kind of need an internet. Technology is important here. And that's why I think the renewable energy example is instructive as well, because if we solved the storage problem for electricity, and if there was not giant centrally controlled power stations, but lots more distributed generation of electricity, could you have an open electricity system? Maybe, but there's a lot of technological barriers in the way of that happening. So that's a lot of philosophical ideas. That's the end. Like I said, the bottom line for me. I hope I gave you some new ideas or some new perspectives on old ideas, and welcome to have questions or discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Very stimulating talk.
Thank you.
I have some quibbles, which are really developed.
Please.
Not saying you're wrong, but
I might be.
it's not binary, abundance, not abundance. I think an example is the explosion that happened when printing was invented. All of a sudden, it was orders of magnitude cheaper to disseminate ideas. Now, I'm saying all of a sudden, but there were steps in there.
Yeah, well, all of a sudden, certainly, given the speed with which things happened at that point in history. Not all of a sudden by our standards, but probably all of a sudden by their standards.
One we don't really remember that was really important was inventing paper made out of pulp from trees in the, let's say,
Right. Yeah, movable type gets all the attention, but it's true, the paper technology was an enabling factor.
Well, the shortage was of rags before that.
Yeah.
Just amazing, you can't think of that stuff. But then information became so much cheaper and easier to disseminate. And it changed the world. We grew up in that world, so we don't realize how dramatic, probably a bigger change than the internet.
Interesting.
But it took steps like Carnegie giving away libraries to different cities in the world. We have a couple in Toronto, for instance. That happened around 1900. All these little steps. The internet didn't happen all at once either. Those of us who saw it in the beginning said, why don't we have it everywhere right now? And
Yes.
it's taken years and years. Anyway, back to what I was really trying to quibble about is it's the, first of all, it's deltas, so the change in the cost of reproduction of things. Again, look at what mass manufacturing has done in the last 150 years.
Well, I think 3D printing is going to accelerate that for certain kinds of things.
It may, but I'm just saying simple reproduction techniques of making cars, for instance, nothing like that happened before. And it's not just cars, but it's bottles and everything else.
Yeah, everything.
We think of the amount of toys that kids have now versus what they had 100 years ago. We live in a world of abundance. So there's a continuum of the cost of each copy and the cost of production. There are two different parts to the price. And when information is free to replicate, and I'd say the book was close to free compared to what was before it,
Compared to before, yeah.
things change. And they had to invent some technology, we call it copyright, to try and harness the almost free part to go and subsidize the creation.
The creation, yeah.
But we look at the perversion of it because it creates a monopoly. And all sorts of problems are there too. It's the same with TV. It's very expensive to produce a good TV show. And it's free to reproduce it. But we don't pay for the production, we pay for the...
Well, the explosion of things on YouTube is interesting that way too, because the number of popular YouTube channels have more viewers than popular TV shows, but the cost of production is very different. So I think there's a lot of, you're right, there's a lot of changes afoot in terms of the cost of producing everything.
We need a model that it's not parasites that can live off production. Because, I mean, I hate the cable companies. They don't seem to add very much value.
Yeah.
So, and we used to hate the record labels and everything. But if somebody doesn't accumulate the power, they may not accumulate the ability to create, to harness the creative effort. Like, I don't see big budget Hollywood movies being made in an open source way.
Sure. Well, and I think there's, so I'm not sure how much of that was picked up in the recording, so just if I can briefly summarize the discussions around the cost of the changing costs of different methods of production of different items. Does it need to be truly abundant, or it's not necessarily a scarce versus abundant? There's a spectrum there, and how might certain things change over time, moving towards this kind of model? How do we make them open gradually? It's not going to be a binary switch. That's a bastard summarization of where you're coming from, I think. Yeah, I think the movie example brings up shades of the Napster story, because the legal framework around the resource there is creating a lot of barriers to it being open. Creative Commons tries to help with some of this stuff, but so much of the world still revolves around money and always will. I mean, there's more paid contributors to Linux than volunteers. So you're always going to have to finance things somehow. And the people in charge of production are going to want to control that. It's interesting, some of what Meki was saying about the way different organizations contribute, perhaps in a very narrow way for their own self-interest versus just sort of, I'm here, I'll help however I want. That's not the default model for most organizations, even within open source systems. I think one of there's a few aspects, if I go way back through the funny story. There needs to be, I think, some way in which the resource is abundant, or at least not constrained, not under somebody's control. But I think the community is really important as well, because open source as a movement draws people in to be part of the community because they can be actors as well as receivers. It's the old proverbial, I have an itch to scratch. So when I think about things like, what about movies or what about other things, I wonder, what is the thing that would drive a community to participate in that, to support the use of that resource as a group, and what are they getting out of doing that? And entertainment is a funny example because to some extent we're used to entertainment being passive, like we receive it, whereas open source is a tool that we use. So we have a lot more itches to scratch, I think. Yeah, that's about as much as I can think of to add to that, but it's very, very stimulating discussion. Yes?
So, I really like the idea of looking at this as an abundant resource. So, I have a couple of comments. One is it's already been mentioned about decreasing cost of distribution.
Yeah.
So, really, you can also look at that as a rate of change function. So, distribution of information, for instance, started out with a lot of constraints, and for instance, it's a cave wall.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a means of communication.
Yeah.
It's durable.
Very durable.
Can't move it though.
Geographically constrained.
So it takes a long time. You get change. You get to play tablets. You get some mobility. You sort of weight issues.
Mm-hmm.
As time progresses, rates of change accelerate, and you begin to get into.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't find the movement into the internet stunning. I think it's actually just a reflection of that accelerating rate of change.
Yes.
So where that would take us next, I don't know. But it does sort of, I think, answer your viewing of it as an abundant resource.
Well, I think
Because
that
to our perspective, I mean, it does seem different. But
different. It's certainly different than, the internet is true. I think if we look at the time scale, large time scale of history, the difference between, like you were saying about books versus the internet, is not as significant as like some previous jumps that may have happened in information technology. I think there's some very interesting effects that happen when the price approaches zero, though. If you've read some of the discussions, I remember in 2000s, people were writing a bit about the magic price point of free, like the difference in people's behavior around resources when the incremental cost actually is zero, or at least they perceive it as zero because they don't perceive a direct cost to them. They're still paying for their ISP, et cetera, but the cost of the no cost versus really small cost actually has a really big psychological effect on people's behavior in communities. So I agree that the internet is not in the scale of how humans have worked with the resources they have, isn't as significant as we maybe think it is in comparison. But I think it does have some really unique characteristics that no previous systems have, and that enable some of the kinds of sharing that we see now.
well, and also that sort of brings me to the other way of approaching it, which is in terms of power structures.
Yeah.
So even if information is free, there's still a utility in controlling
Mm-hmm.
information.
Yes.
So it may be free to produce. It may even, in fact, medieval guilds are sort of sharing within a small community in order to create a resource which could then give them control over an income source.
Mm-hmm.
So,
App stores, for example.
yeah. So I think this brings up the question about openness,
Mm-hmm.
and not just open source, but openness. So there are all sorts of technologies that maybe have been controlled and then lost because they weren't really
Mm-hmm.
open in the sense that they were freely available.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that aspect, I think, about open source, which means that it's not just created and free or shared, it's truly open, and that there are no constraints on who can access it.
Yeah, the community around it is not limited in what they can do. This is why I think the GPL as a licensing mechanism is so important, because there's all the sort of practical ethos around how open source happens with release early and often, and how you attract and retain contributors and so on. But the licensing is really fundamental because it doesn't, because it's what gives you the freedom. You can choose to do whatever you want, and there's lots of, under GPL2, web apps weren't required to distribute any source code. You could run your web app on a server and it would essentially be locked up, even though you were using open source code. So you could have lots of, you could do whatever you wanted, but the idea that you as a user were free to make those changes is what's really important. I think that's when I think of the importance of the community being able to support the use of the resource, that freedom is one of the essential characteristics. And it's missing in cases where some control of the locus of power, like the App Store, or like the colossal distribution system for electricity, there's these barriers in the way of our freedom of access or use of this resource for one reason or another. And that's, I think, one of the things that keeps it from being open. There's some at the back, and then we'll get back. Yes?
Yeah. First thing where I strongly disagree with you is Airbnb and Uber are not part of the sharing economy.
Okay.
They're just...
There's lots of breathless commentators that would disagree. I'm sort of setting up as a bit of a straw man, so I'm interested in how you demolish that.
The capitalistic model that take advantage of a slack.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look, for example, like going back on Airbnb, people are looking on one side for profit,
Mm-hmm.
like I have some room free and I can make money from it, and the other side just I can slip to another city for cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And behind this, it's just a monetary transaction where both gain money. One gain, the other one save. Couch surfing probably is closer to, because there is also this notion of building something together. It's like also building a relationship.
Yes.
For Uber, something not as developed in North America, but it's more like carpooling idea, which is I'm going from A to B. I've got a slack of 3 seats, and I'm just going to give them just shares the cost. I'm not trying to make money out of it. And linking back to open source, and if you look, for example, how the Apache server, the Apache Foundation started, it was like people having the same problem.
Yes.
And getting together to build something. And I think that's all around this, have a common interest and realizing that it's better to work all together to improve it than competing against each other.
So to summarize, there's a question of whether Airbnb and Uber are good examples of the sharing economy at all. Fair question. Couch surfing and other car sharing services might be more appropriate. And Apache, yes, is a fantastic example, I think, of a fairly spontaneous community developing, actually. The history of the Apache project is really fascinating, and I think we owe an awful lot to Microsoft's misunderstanding of the internet at that point in time, because they went after the browser, not the server. Imagine if they had done to the server space what they did to the browser space and Netscape. Holy cow, that would have been a very different internet. But they went after the browser because it's what was threatening their desktop monopoly, because the browser was a platform that you could run things in, and you were no longer necessarily beholden to the desktop. So that's what they went after. Meanwhile, people who had a common interest in servers banded together and created Apache as we know it today. And it was a small group of people who just did that in the most open source way possible. And they won. Apache was is the dominant server on the internet. And IIS is just, you don't want to use it if you can avoid it. So I think, and that speaks, I think, to the, again, importance of the community. I think the abundance, the aspects of a resource that make it abundant or approaching abundance are a fundamental enabling factor. I don't know where the line is. You have to hit truly zero cost or what cost you have to hit, but there has to be some sense of abundance. There has to be a lack of anybody fundamentally controlling the resource. But there has to be the community that then has that self-interest to band together and promote the use and empowerment of others in whatever this resource is. And this is maybe worth pointing out also that I think of community in this sense as community per project, not like the open source community writ large. I think in the way I'm thinking about it here, there's a community around Apache that supports and empowers people in the use of that source code. And there's a community around Firefox that does the same thing for that body of source code. I'm not talking about the open source community versus the Wikipedia community as like two communities. There's lots of open source communities. And it's the behavior of a particular open source community around its particular source code that's what I'm talking about here. One more back here. Yes?
Yes. Well, 2 points. One is I would also doubt the idea that renewable electricity is ever going to be free. For example, Quebec has 90%.
Well, yeah, hydroelectric power, yeah. But it's so centralized. See, what if we all had solar power arrays on all of our houses?
Well, countries like Germany and Denmark are approaching that, and they are in fact having increasing costs because of capital. And that's what it's not free in the sense that you have to repay the capital, the renewable power. But I wanted to make a point more about the long tail by Chris Anderson. So he makes the point that the value of just, for example, in books, the fact that books that were no longer in print became valuable when Amazon could enable people who wanted a book to connect to that rare book, like one copy in the world. So the cost of transaction, the cost of creating a connection between a consumer and a supplier was close to zero in the long tail. That's what creates community. So these connection is connecting. So I think it would be a useful way to think about that cost isn't the driving determination, it's about the cost of connection, transaction cost of connection between a want and a need and a supplier. And if there's an area of abundance, that cost has to be very low for that connection thing to work.
So just to summarize, one brief comment about renewable energy, that the cost may never go down to zero. And in Germany, there's a lot more renewable energy, but their costs have gone up because the infrastructure involved. So just one point to that I'd add. The cost of producing open source software is not zero either. It's an abundant resource, but all the people at IBM that work on Linux are paid a lot of money for their time and expertise to do that. So open systems don't have to be free, per se. They can have very high costs involved. Some of those people are paid very handsomely. But you're right, electricity is sort of my pet example because I wish it were the case. I think it's a long way from being the case. And the other thing, if I can summarize, you're talking about Amazon and the long tail aspects of having so many books that are out of print but now are maybe possible to produce on a micro scale, and the transaction costs being very low enables that. Yes, the only thing that comes to mind in response or to add to that is one of the reasons I like the term abundance is it doesn't presuppose where the abundance happens. It could be in the production cost, it could be in the transaction cost, it could be just in the prevalence or the accessibility of the resource or whatever it is. There has to be some abundant aspect. I think the issue, one of the challenges with the example of Amazon and books is, of course, it's all controlled by Amazon. Like if we had, like, say, Wikipedia in charge of that instead of Amazon, like, would that get us closer to open? And it brings us back to questions of the locus of power. Who's actually in control of this? I think that becomes then a potential barrier to the community aspects of a truly open system. Yes, you've been very patient.
I'm very talkative.
Just a minute. This is a wonderful discussion, and there is a venue for taking this discussion further.
Okay, there we go.
In the reception room that can be lubricated with either soft drinks or beer or wine. So I invite you to take your questions and continue this
There we go.
in the place where you had lunch today. Julian, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.